In this video, we'll be discussing 15 AWS CloudTrail strategies. Every action taken in your AWS account leaves a trace, and the difference between catching a breach in minutes versus discovering it months later often comes down to how well you have configured your audit logging. AWS CloudTrail is the service that records those traces, and getting it right is one of the highest leverage things a cloud team can do for security and compliance. This video walks through 15 strategies for configuring CloudTrail so it captures everything you need, stays secure and tamper-evident, and actually gets used to detect and respond to threats. 15 AWS CloudTrail strategies. 1. Enable CloudTrail in all regions. 2. Multi-region trails for centralized management. 3. Integrate with Amazon CloudWatch for real-time monitoring. 4. Enable data event logging for S3 and Lambda. 5. Multiple trails for different compliance requirements. 6. Secure S3 buckets for CloudTrail logs. 7. AWS IAM policies for fine-grained control. 8. Set up log file integrity validation. 9. AWS organizations for centralized management. 10. Automate responses with Lambda functions. 11. Regularly review and optimize CloudTrail configurations. 12. Analyze CloudTrail logs with Amazon Athena. 13. Integrate with AWS Security Hub and Guard Duty. 14. Archive long-term logs for compliance. 15. Educate teams on CloudTrail insights. 1. Enable CloudTrail in all regions. Why log every region? Enabling CloudTrail across every AWS region, not just the ones you actively use, matters because global services like IAM record centrally, but attackers and misconfigurations often show up in regions your team never touches. Enabling it everywhere closes that blind spot, whether the activity comes through the console, CLI, or SDK. Treat all region logging as a baseline account setup requirement, not an optional step for later. 2. Multi-region trails for centralized management. A multi-region trail lets you aggregate all of that activity into a single Amazon S3 bucket instead of managing a separate trail per region, which dramatically simplifies operations. Your security team gets one consistent place to look, and the trail automatically extends to any new AWS region that launches later. Set this up during initial account setup so you never have a gap between account creation and full coverage. 3. Integrate with Amazon CloudWatch for real-time monitoring. Raw log files sitting in S3 are useful for forensics, but they do not help you react to a threat as it unfolds. Sending CloudTrail events to CloudWatch logs and building alarms on top of specific event patterns turns your audit trail into a real-time detection system. Alert immediately on root account usage, security group changes, disabled trails, or failed console logins, with notifications through Amazon SNS. Start with a small set of high-signal alarms, since alert fatigue defeats the purpose. 4. Enable data event logging for S3 and Lambda. By default, CloudTrail captures management events, the API calls that create, modify, or delete resources, but it does not log data events like individual reads and writes to S3 objects or Lambda invocations. Turning that on gives you visibility into exactly who accessed which object or triggered which function, which is essential for investigating data exfiltration. Because data events are far higher volume than management events, enabling them everywhere can get expensive quickly. Target your most sensitive buckets and functions first, then expand as your budget justifies it. 5. Multiple trails for different compliance requirements. Different regulatory frameworks demand different retention periods, encryption standards, or log destinations, and forcing one trail to satisfy every requirement tends to end in compromise. Running multiple trails lets you tailor each one to a specific need, like an extended, immutable retention period for a compliance archive alongside a trail for day-to-day monitoring. This also limits the blast radius of a misconfiguration, since a mistake in one trail does not compromise the others. Document which trail satisfies which obligation so the mapping is clear during an audit. 6. Secure S3 buckets for CloudTrail logs. CloudTrail logs are only as trustworthy as the storage they live in, so the S3 buckets holding them need to be locked down like any other sensitive data store. Restrict write and delete access to a small set of IAM roles. Enable server-side encryption and turn on bucket versioning so an accidental deletion can be recovered. A misconfigured CloudTrail bucket exposed to the internet is a serious and surprisingly common finding in security audits. Treat any change to that bucket policy as a reviewed, change-managed process. 7. AWS IAM policies for fine-grained control. Access to CloudTrail configurations and log data should follow the same least privilege principle you apply everywhere else in AWS. Grant most analysts read-only access while reserving configuration changes like stopping a trail for trusted administrators. This matters because CloudTrail is often a target for attackers covering their tracks after compromising an overprivileged identity. Use IAM Access Analyzer periodically to check that permissions have not drifted wider than intended. I should mention, this presentation is a condensed version of the complete article on systemsarchitect.io. View the full article with more details there. 8. Set up log file integrity validation. What does integrity validation actually prove? Log file integrity validation adds a cryptographic layer on top of your CloudTrail logs, generating digest files that let you verify a log has not been altered or deleted after delivery. This is especially valuable in forensic investigations and legal proceedings, where you need to prove the evidence was not tampered with. Turning it on is essentially free since it just adds signed digest files alongside your existing logs. Retroactively proving the integrity of logs written before validation was turned on is simply not possible. 9. AWS organizations for centralized management. For any environment running more than a handful of AWS accounts, configuring CloudTrail individually in each one quickly becomes unmanageable. AWS Organizations lets you create an organization trail that automatically applies to every member account, including new ones, giving your team one consolidated view across the entire organization. It also prevents the common failure mode where a newly provisioned account sits unmonitored simply because someone forgot to configure logging for it. Lock down permissions so member accounts cannot disable the organization trail. 10. Automate responses with Lambda functions. CloudTrail events flowing into CloudWatch or EventBridge can trigger AWS Lambda functions that respond automatically, turning detection into remediation without waiting on a human. A classic example is automatically revoking compromised IAM credentials or reverting an unauthorized security group change, which shrinks remediation time from hours to seconds. This frees your team to focus on investigating novel events rather than handling routine ones manually. Start with low-risk, high-confidence actions and expand as you build trust in the detection logic. 11. Regularly review and optimize CloudTrail configurations. CloudTrail configurations are not a set-it-and-forget-it exercise, since your resources, compliance obligations, and cost tolerance all change over time. Periodic reviews confirm that retention periods, encryption settings, and data event scope still match what is actually sensitive today. These reviews also catch configuration drift, such as a trail accidentally scoped down after a restructuring. Put configuration review on a recurring calendar cadence, such as quarterly. 12. Analyze CloudTrail logs with Amazon Athena. Why use Athena for CloudTrail? CloudTrail logs stored in S3 can be queried directly with Amazon Athena, a serverless SQL query service, without standing up any infrastructure. This lets your teams run ad hoc investigations like finding every API call made by a specific IAM user, or build recurring reports. Structuring your logs with a well-defined table schema and partitioning by date significantly speeds up queries and keeps costs down. Set up a few saved queries for your most common patterns so analysts are not writing SQL from scratch every time. 13. Integrate with AWS Security Hub and Guard Duty. CloudTrail data becomes far more powerful when it feeds into purpose-built threat detection rather than being reviewed manually. Amazon Guard Duty continuously analyzes CloudTrail events to identify patterns consistent with compromised credentials, reconnaissance, or known malicious infrastructure, without you writing your own rules. AWS Security Hub then aggregates those findings into one prioritized dashboard your team can triage. Enable both services account-wide from the start, since detection value compounds over time. 14. Archive long-term logs for compliance. Many compliance frameworks require retaining audit logs for years, but keeping all that data in standard S3 storage indefinitely is unnecessarily expensive once it is rarely accessed. Lifecycle policies that move older CloudTrail logs into S3 Glacier preserve multi-year retention mandates at a fraction of the cost. Glacier's retrieval times run in hours rather than seconds, which is perfectly acceptable for the infrequent planned access long-term archives typically see. Configure the lifecycle rule when you create the trail so no log sits in expensive storage longer than needed. 15. Educate teams on CloudTrail insights. Number 15. Even a perfectly configured CloudTrail setup delivers little value if the people receiving its alerts cannot interpret them. Teams need regular training on what normal API activity looks like for your environment, so they recognize what is genuinely anomalous. Why does context matter so much? Context is what separates a fast, confident response from a slow, uncertain one, and it keeps institutional knowledge current as your architecture evolves. Review real findings, including false positives, as a recurring team exercise. In summary, getting CloudTrail right is less about flipping one switch and more about layering these 15 strategies together. Broad regional coverage, tight security around the logs, real-time monitoring, and a team that knows how to read the data. Start with all region trails and lock down S3 storage, then build outward into automated detection and response. Done well, CloudTrail stops being a compliance checkbox and becomes one of the most valuable tools your team has for defending your AWS environment. Thanks for checking out this video. Hope you liked it and subscribe to the channel. Find a lot more articles and guides both on systemsarchitect.io and codeguides.io. Again, that's systemsarchitect.io and codeguides.io.